Introduction to Blender 2.8 Cycles Render Settings. Blender has a lot of settings to control how it renders the scene. At first glance, it can seem overwhelming. However, if we break it down into its component parts, then things will start to become more understandable. Since Cycles and EEVEE have different render options, I will cover both of them in separate videos. In this video, I will be covering Cycles render settings. There are many important settings to cover, so let's get started in the Render tab of the Properties editor. Since there are quite a few settings here, I will cover the more important settings first. I do not think that there is a more important setting than the number of samples. Samples are a double-edged sword in that the more you have, the more you sacrifice render time for higher quality. The higher the number of samples, the less noisy the image will be. You can also set the number of samples to take while in rendered mode. I like to have this value set to 1. The image may be very grainy, but I will very quickly see what the rendered image will look something like. The light paths are another important setting. I usually leave these settings alone, for the exception of that I change the volume setting to 4 only if my animation has materials with transparency. The clamping values can be used to remove fireflies that more sampling alone has not got rid of. Fireflies are where a few pixels are much brighter than the surrounding pixels, and they are much brighter than what they should be. In real life, fast movement creates motion blurring in the video. In animating, this does not naturally happen. You can set Blender to create the motion blur effect in the render by enabling motion blur. The motion blur in Cycles has the most options. You can set the effect to start, end, or be centered on the current frame. You can change the time taken between the shutter opening and the shutter closing. In Blender 2.8, this is directly proportional to the time between frames. You can recreate the rolling shutter of a camera and change the duration of the rolling shutter as well as how the shutter moves between frames. In the film options, there are two important settings. One is exposure, which changes how bright the rendered image is, and the other is the transparent setting, which makes Blender render the world background as transparent. In the performance option group, the tiles is the most important setting. Although for the most part it is fine as it is, the more cores your computer has, the smaller the number should be. This is so it becomes less likely that cores will not be used while some are finished rendering their section of the image. The Progressive Refine option makes Blender render the image like it would in the 3D editor while in rendered mode. This means that Blender will progressively render the whole image with more and more samples. The final important thing to cover in the Render tab is the Bake settings. Here you can bake aspects of one object onto another object. So far I have only used this to bake normal maps, a way to fake a higher polygon count object with a lower polygon count object. If you look closely at the object, the illusion will not work. In Blender 2.8, some settings were split off from the Render tab and placed into their own Output tab. The one thing to note is the output settings are the same between the 3 different render engines. In the Render tab, you can set the resolution of the rendered image. I have rendered square images and used the rendered result for animated textures. You can change the folder that Blender places the rendered images in, the file format, the color format, the color depth, and the amount of compression of the image. There are various amounts of image formats that you can choose. I have used PNG files a lot, as the format can save alpha values, alpha being transparency in the image. There are 3 movie formats that can be used, with FFmpeg video having the most options. It is always recommended to render an animation as images and then re-render the image sequence into a video format. The reason is, if one frame fails or the computer crashes during the render, then it is possible to re-render the failed frame or start rendering after the frame that the computer crashed. It is also possible to change sections of the animation with new frames if you decide that you don't like the original frames. I do not usually keep rendered frames on my computer, as they usually take up a lot more space compared to a single rendered video. Here are the rendered images from the constraints and drivers video. I can select all of them by using A and add them all at the same time to the video editor. From here, I will change the format to being a video file and then re-render the animation. It will not take very long to render the animation, and if you notice something that you need to fix, it becomes much easier to do so. I like to change the container to be MP4. This container keeps the frame rate of the animation and retains the quality as well. The one important thing to note is that although the FFmpeg format can support audio, it starts off as not including audio in the output file. I like to change the setting to MP3 if I'm going to render an animation that has audio. This is mostly because of my own personal audio preferences. The post-processing settings are the final options that are important in the Output tab. However, I generally leave these settings alone, as they will not affect the rendered image as long as you have not used the editor that they correspond to. There are 2 important settings in the View Layer tab that you should be aware of. You can enable or disable denoising, and enable or disable various passes that Blender can create. These passes can be used in the compositor to create various effects. It should be noted that denoising, though powerful, is not a one-size-fits-all solution, and in some cases can make things worse. In the past, I have used the mist pass to fade the fire clipping plane to the world background color instead of having a sharp transition. This was a long topic, and if you're still here, I would like to thank you for watching the whole video, and happy animating!